Hi, so welcome to the GSWS Research Roundtable. My name is Helen Leung, and I'm really excited today to have invited several of our department's faculty members who do research on aspects of Asian and Asian diasporic communities. And so I want to welcome Nadine Attewell. Hi, Nadine. Vaibhav Saria. Hi, V. And May Farrales. Hi, May. So the format of today's roundtable is really for each of us to come up with a question that we would like to share and ask each other. And I thought I would start because the question I have actually involves why we're doing this in the first place. In recent years, there's been a lot of talk about expanding the format of knowledge mobilization. And there's been like increased kind of urgency about the need to communicate our research not only to scholars, but also to the public and to communities to whom the research is relevant. And I've seen colleagues do amazing things like graphic novels, they do podcasts, and they do videos. And so I'm curious about what you think about this sort of attention to different kinds of knowledge mobilization, whether you enjoy doing it, and what kind of challenges or issues that you've run into.
I have not ventured into the realm of doing anything incredibly creative in terms of taking my research and things that I've written to the different communities that I've been working with. But you know, that's why I'm very glad and lucky to be with colleagues that are doing that as a way for me to learn how to, you know, bring what I've been learning from my conversations with them to back to the community. But I've had the privilege of doing community engagement sessions and report backs and conversations about my research and to different members of the Filipino communities, both here on Coast Salish territories, but also up north in Leyte territories or Tagalog-speaking territories. And the conversation is always lively, but in terms of the difficulties, I think it's the unevenness that I bring to these spaces in terms of the time and privilege that I have to think about a lot of what they shared with me, and then to bring it back. I've had great reception, but also a lot of pushback on certain ways that I've engaged with their stories and materials, and I've always appreciated those moments of pushback, which forced me to reckon with who am I as an academic, who am I as a researcher, and fundamentally, what am I doing? So, and who am I accountable to? So I've really appreciated those opportunities, and yeah, I think the unevenness of what I bring, but also in the community, the different perspectives the community brings forward, and the different. I think it's important to recognize that even within the Filipino community, it's a diverse community with different experiences, backgrounds, and positionalities, and understanding that I think is really important in terms of how to relate the research that I do.
That is interesting around the kind of unevenness, and also, oftentimes it's the researcher who chooses the venue of knowledge mobilization, right? Like, I wonder if any of you had experience where, your participants or your texts or the kind of the other side of your research actually give you ideas for a kind of mobilization that's different. Maybe I'll ask V, because you also, you do deep ethnography, and you are actually really embedded in the community, right? Do they tell you you have to put our lives into this form as opposed to just, what we're used to doing in scholarship?
Yeah, I think what one of these questions provoked me to rethink in some ways what has been the challenges of knowledge mobilization in my research. And I think one of the challenges has been to uh, somewhat reconfigure the structure of research and knowledge mobilization. So, for example, with my research on tuberculosis, it's this question that's making me rethink why is it that even though we have so much evidence in our research that the most influential person who um, makes sure that the patient is taking their medicine and is completing the treatment and is not disheartened is not the healthcare provider, but these other host of characters like the shopkeeper from where the patient gets the medicine. It's actually the shopkeeper intervening and saying, "Oh, how are you doing? Are you taking the medicines?" So actually, but those kind of not peripheral, but minor characters in the idea we have of healthcare delivery is not actually seen as important. And even though and I think that's one of the challenges of knowledge mobilization, even though my ethnography kept on saying, look, they're actually going to the provider, the healthcare provider, just once every 3 months for a checkup, but they actually have follow-ups with the community health worker, the medicine shop owner, and maybe we should actually strengthen that network. And why isn't that input actually get taken up and completely redesign how we think of knowledge dissemination? So, yeah, I think maybe it's not always apparent to us, but maybe there are channels through which information flows, and we actually haven't. And the challenge is actually to find something that cuts through all these channels and allow for new connections to emerge.
For Nadine, because you work mostly with text, with images, with archival material, like how does that, and theory as well, and like so. Have you ever like needed to explain all of that or present all of that to like non-scholarly communities?
I mean, I think this is always an interesting question for someone, like me who was trained in literary studies, right? And so on the one hand, I think we haven't necessarily, because our methodology is very text-based, we talk about, right, the author is dead, right? There's this real sort of disconnect in some ways and a deliberate methodological disconnect in some ways that people have talked about between texts and so on the one hand, we think a lot about text and context, and also we do a kind of work to think about the way texts circulate outside of out of context. And there are problems with all of this. And then so it's not, I think, been conventional in the field to really think a lot about. I think that's changing, but it's not been conventional to think about, how we might bring our work to a public or to a community. But on the other hand, right, and I talk about this with my students who are a public, right, our community that we do translation work with or work with. I point out that, people are analyzing cultural texts all the time, right? There's so much, like there's so many websites and so many articles, and on Twitter, like every night, there's a trending show that everyone is watching, right? It's what we do, and a lot of that is driven by, and so there's a kind of ordinariness, right? Also to the kind of, and it's not natural. It comes out of everybody takes English courses. There's a whole history. I suspect that's not work that I do, but there's a whole history. There's a reason why we have these habits of talking about cultural texts in the way that we do. But it makes me think more generally about the fact that I think for me, and I think for a lot of scholars who kind of who do feminist scholarship or feminist and queer scholarship, where our methods are informed by that work, whether we're in women's studies departments or not. We work on things. I work on sort of experiences, concepts that are very, in some ways, very ordinary, very everyday, very personal. So I work on like my first book was on reproduction. I work on intimacy. I work on the body, and I'm interested in the way that sort of big structures and big systems, colonialism, right, racial formation, are sort of felt in these practices and experiences that are very close into us, right? And on the one hand, I think there's ways in which they can be really hard to think about, right? Um, and so that can be, if I'm trying to think a little differently, or trying both. I'm being inspired to think differently by the stories and the texts that I'm encountering, and I want us, more collectively, to be thinking differently. But it's stuff that's really close really close in for people, right? People really attached to the ways they think about X or Y, right? How they love others, and how we live with others, right? Or what do our children mean to us, and so on. And then on the other hand, again, I think there's a reason why, right? The personal is political has been a kind of political project, right, for so many movements, right? Feminism, but also, various kinds of revolutionary projects, right? This as a set of consciousness raising. So it's always this kind of back and forth, right? It's very concrete for people. It's very close in. I give talks on these histories of, for example, racial mixing and interracial relationships and, multiracial families, and people are like, how should I raise my mixed race child, right? This very personal, very odd kind of encounter. But, I think so there's a kind of, there's possibility there, there's excitement and engagement, and also challenge, right? I think that can be challenging sometimes.
I was just thinking about both V and Nadine's insights about what's in the peripheral, form, how that might form different sets of entanglements and bring different ways of looking at things and thinking about things. But the challenge that I have is to then give a coherent script, of to tell a narrative, which we're expected to do in these public engagement sessions or whatnot, and to tie things up, which I've been challenged to be more messy by queer of color scholars, asking me where's the fun, where's the mess, where's the ordinariness, right? Where's the fun in the ordinariness? And I find that challenging to do, to celebrate that ordinariness and those different entanglements that are more in the periphery, because I think of what Nadine was talking about, of what we attach ourselves to. And very much when I'm engaging with the community, there's a large part of the Filipinx community that's attached to this idea of nation, that the peripheral kind of feelings, intimacies, entanglements that make us who we are, that actually orient us to the nation, are left kind of out of the picture and out of the conversation. So yeah, I find that, and when I'm thinking about evenacy, I'm thinking about that. How do I talk with someone whose primary concern is getting their kid to be reunited with their child, who they've been separated from for 8 years, and once they arrive, what school should they go to, right? How do I continue that conversation with them that might allow for other kinds of conversations around, those bigger picture things that Nadine was talking about, colonialism, our place here on still Indigenous territories and whatnot. I think that's, for me, what I find really exciting, because people outside of academia and in the communities are doing that in really, really cool, interesting ways. I think far more interesting than what I've been able to do. So I'm really excited to be in conversation with them.